here's one from Linda. Name of Spurge's book, please.
It's Shakespeare's Imagery and What It Tells Us. Spurgeon. Spurgeon, yeah. Shakespeare's Imagery and What It Tells Us.
What's your question?
Okay, my question, well, I have two, and perhaps Robin can answer whichever one she likes, but I'm thinking perhaps, by the way, I read your book, and it is just amazing. I got it as a lark, kind of as a kind of odd idea, and I was really just blown away by it.
Thank you, Carol.
I was wondering if her focus on war could be because of the death of her brother in war, who was, it seemed that they were so close, that was totally devastating to her to lose her brother in war. And my other question was, do you think that it's possible that she wrote some of the canon and that somebody else wrote others, because they could have shared a common style at the time? Do you think it's possible that she wrote the sonnets, some of the plays, and somebody else had some influence too? Whichever question you the brother in war, or the
well, I'm sure anyone's brother in war, anyone's son in war, is going to give you a different perspective on war, especially as a mother. I don't, there's no answers. If those answers were easy, my feeling about co-authors, too, the Oxfordians have done a lot of work on dating the plays earlier, which I find interesting, because I often wonder if Philip Sidney was a co-author on some of those, but he died in 1586. My problem with co-authorship in general is that I wrote 75 computer books, and I sometimes had co-authors. Having a co-author was more work than writing the book myself. Because if you're the best author on the book, I ended up having to rewrite everybody's stuff and research everybody's stuff. It was awful. It was easier just to do it myself, except for my sweetheart, John, who I trained to write. So in that sense, yes, there are people who may be saying, well, why don't you think about writing it this way? Let's work a little harder on this. There absolutely might have been. I couldn't put my foot down either which way, that they absolutely weren't or they absolutely were. But I love that you're thinking about it, Carol.
Okay, Mark has a question. Wondering if you know a work called Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being by Ted Hughes, because it provides a feminist interpretation of the entire canon.
I would have to check with Amazon, since I buy most of my books. I love it that they tell me, oh yeah, you bought this book on April 3rd, 2012. But it sounds, I have 12,000 books in my library, so it might be there. But is there a recommendation? I mean, you would recommend I look into it?
Well, Ted Hughes wrote an exhaustive study of the entire canon. He was, as you know, he was a poet laureate for 20 years in England, and quite a scholar. I wouldn't call him a scholar. He was a great poet and understood the theater, and took 20 years to write this book that gives a feminist interpretation of the entire canon, beginning with Venus and Adonis. The idea of Adonis rejecting Venus, basically rejecting the goddess, and that idea and theme running through and actually in causing the tragedies, and then subsequently healing those tragedies through the romantic plays, The Tempest. And it's quite a study. It's an amazing book. It's almost impossible to read. It's so dense and difficult. But if you haven't read it, and if any of the viewers haven't read it, it's quite a study on the feminine aspect of the canon. So I won't say any more than that, but it's a very interesting book.
Mark, thanks so much. And it's called Shakespeare and what about the goddess?
It's called Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being and it just changed my understanding of the arc of Shakespeare's creative process, from his
Great.
early poem, Venus and Adonis, to the Tempest and the Winter's Tale.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Surely.
Okay, Norm says the sonnets were written by a man, according to your theory?
Not according to my theory. The sonnets are most of them written to a man as traditional scholarship. Traditional scholarship has always said the sonnets were written to a man, which is what made me first think, well, if they were written to a man, and we don't know who the author is, maybe a woman wrote love poems to a man. So that's not a big leap. Not a real big leap. So that's where I started. No, I think the sonnets were, I think the first 17, the procreation sonnets, were probably written to Philip Sidney, heir to 2 or 3 earls. He had no children yet. The importance of having an heir, because if you have stuff and you die, and you're in that social class, it all goes back to the king or the queen. So a very practical reason to have a child. Then I think most of them were written to about her younger lover who's just a couple years older than her son. I mean, there's a lot to talk about with the sonnets, but it's not my idea they're written to man. That's standard scholarship.
Okay, the question actually was, the sonnets were written by a man or not?
Oh, well, I think they were written by a woman.
Okay.
Most people think they were written by a man.
Right. Okay. The next question is from Ellen. Is there an analysis of writing styles that highlights some of Shakespeare's style as feminine?
I've looked into a lot of those. The part of the problem that the people who write about those is that Shakespeare doesn't write like a novel. Shakespeare's syntax is convoluted, etc. It's hard in the traditional studies of what's male or female to compare Shakespeare to that. But I think by looking at what Shakespeare says, where Shakespeare's focus seems to be, tells us a lot. But if you find some of the studies and see a pattern, let me know.
And Ellen has another question. You focused on the plays, and what about the sonnets?
Yeah, I did focus on the plays. Yeah, I should include the sonnets in here. So I should go look at those. Thank you.
Here's a question from Jillian. Has textual analysis been done to compare Mary Sidney's writings and those attributed to Shakespeare?
Yeah, there has been. And of course, the people who do those tend to want it to be Shakespeare and not her, but also they're very different. Her Antony and Cleopatra is her Antony is a very direct translation from French, almost like a study in how can I translate the French language into this piece. So as a direct translation, you're not seeing a lot of the inner workings of that person. Her other, almost all of her pieces were translations because that's all she was allowed, because you're translating from a man. And they were considered inferior pieces. But I can see similarities in some of the emotional work of Antony and Cleopatra. What's the other one I'm thinking? Oh, Discourse of Life and Death, translated from
De Mornay.
De Mornay. Yeah, okay. That are just beautiful, just have such resonance with things that are said in Measure for Measure, and other plays about, have references to death. But people have done studies, but they also say that the sonnets weren't written by the same person who wrote the plays, because in that kind of comparison, it's really difficult to state those kind of similarities. I feel there is, but it's subjective.
Here's a question from Cheryl. Was Shakespeare perhaps looking at the reasons wars come to be fought did not justify the costs of war, not just in lives, like the Trojan War, for example?
Absolutely. One of my reading groups is going through the history plays right now, and we see that in every single play. Shakespeare really questions why are you in this war? But doesn't come down on one side or the other. So ambiguous, but seriously big questions about why are we in this damn war, and is it worth it? And in Troilus and Cressida also, never giving us a clear answer.
Here's another question from Cheryl. Would sonnets written by a man to a man have been published in Shakespeare's time?
Well, there is some puzzlement about the publishing. That famous dedication from what seems to be the publisher, not the author. That publisher, shortly after that, got some perks from William Herbert. It was never published again in Shakespeare's time. There are a lot of questions about that exact question. Yes, you're absolutely right. I don't have answers for those.
From Kelly, if the sonnets were written by a woman, how do you interpret those addressed to the Dark Lady?
Well, I'd go at length at that in my book. My personal theory of this is, and this is based on a play written by Mary Sidney's niece, Mary Roth, who wrote a play that parallels that part of the sonnets, in which Mary Sidney had this younger lover. Mary Sidney then thinks this woman, this younger, dark-haired, dark-eyed woman, is having an affair with a younger lover. It turns out through Mary Roth's play, in Mary Roth's play, that mistake is also made, that Mary Sidney's lover character is in love with Mary Roth. Mary Roth clears everything up, says, no, I'm not in love with your lover. I'm actually in love with your son, Will. You have my will, you have your will, you have will in abundance, says the sonnet. So I think those ones to the Dark Lady are to her dark-haired, dark-eyed niece, who she loves dearly. But that's my theory, until we find Shakespeare's diary, everything is just a theory.
That's good.
But this theory does have something based in reality.
Here's a question from Norm. Amelia Bassano, do you think she may have assisted Mary?
If you go straight to the original arguments of the author, they are so full of surely, must have, certainly, might have, oh, perhaps this, until Amelia becomes a Black Jewish woman. It's amazing the torture that you have to go through to get there. She did write some interesting things. She might have been in the Wilton Circle. It's not recorded that she was. But I don't find the arguments for her, if you go straight to the original arguments and judiciously say what's truth here and what's made up, it doesn't hold water for me. Apple TV is producing a series about Amelia Lanier as author.
Go ahead, Adrian.
Yes. I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed to Robin for her book and today's lecture, which was absolutely blown away. I wonder if, could I ask whether you've read the book, A Woman's Worth?
A Woman's Worth?
A Woman's Worth, which was published in 1599 and talks about women being not equal to men, but being better than men in all sorts of fields. And it discusses several of the characters that work their way into plays. And it was written just before As You Like It. And As You Like It makes a direct reference to it in the question of the poor deer that's weeping. The great thing about women is they can cry, and animals can cry, and the deer can cry.
I've heard of a couple of those books, but I have not read it, but I am going to go order it right now. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. That will be really valuable.
The sonnets, obviously, particularly, I don't hold that the first 17 are just sort of technical sonnets. They really are exciting love sonnets written by a woman to the man whom she eventually marries. And her name is there, threaded through it, along with his, Hal Wriothesley, and her name is Elizabeth Vernon, and she becomes the wife. And so the sonnet where it says about the true love, it is not a metaphor, but it's for real. She married him, and she wrote all the plays, and her relatives had them put on because her relatives and friends were the Careys and the Stanleys, and they got Shakespeare's company to put on her plays.
Very interesting, Adrian. Thank you. I love it that at least it's a woman. That
Right.
It's a woman, definitely a woman, a beautiful, here she is.
Kristen, you must know her, huh? Thanks, Adrian.
We have some time left before we have like 10 minutes left. If anyone wants to stay, we're going to do breakout rooms for small discussion. And if you have a chance to write in the chat, you could say something to Robin and she will get a copy of the chat.
Well, Mary Sidney Society.org and iReadShakespeare.org for the reading groups.